Story number 1.
The house had always been a thing of rumors in the small town, whispered about, spoken of in hushed tones, and avoided at all costs. But it wasn't always this way. In the years before it was abandoned, the house had been the pride of the town, a stately home with sprawling gardens built by a well-to-do family who had lived there for generations. But all that had changed when the family mysteriously disappeared. No one knew what had happened. One day, they were simply gone. Their belongings left behind, the windows left wide open to let the wind rustle through the dust-covered rooms. No note, no sign of a struggle, nothing to indicate where they had gone. The house stood empty, the garden grew wild, and the town slowly moved on. But the stories of the house remained. Every local had their own tale to tell. Some swore they'd seen lights flickering in the windows at night, others heard the sounds of music or children's laughter echoing on the wind, but most terrifying of all were the accounts of the strange noises that seemed to emanate from the house, creaking floorboards, faint whispers, the sound of something or someone moving around when no one was there. Sarah had heard the stories growing up. She had heard the warnings from her parents and her friends' parents, the ominous glances when the subject of the old house came up. It was something everyone knew about, but no one spoke of in any real detail. But Sarah was different. She had always been curious, always skeptical of things that could not be explained. And as she grew older, her curiosity turned into something more, a need to understand, to see for herself. It was early fall when she decided she would finally venture into the house. The air was crisp, the sky a deep blue with a few wisps of clouds hanging low. The wind rustled the dried leaves that littered the overgrown garden, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she stood before the decaying front door. She had passed by the house countless times before, but never like this. Tonight, she would go inside. The door was slightly ajar, a broken latch hanging from the side. She pushed it open, the sound of the creaking hinges piercing the silence. The air inside was cold, too cold for a house that had been abandoned for so long. Her flashlight flickered on as she stepped inside, the beam of light revealing the decayed state of the entryway. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she moved further into the house, her breath visible in the air, despite the fact that it was warm outside. The smell of dust and mildew hung heavy in the air. The walls, once bright and full of life, were now cracked and peeling, their once vibrant wallpaper faded and stained with age. The furniture, what remained of it, was covered in a thick layer of dust, as though frozen in time, waiting for someone to return and reclaim it. Sarah hesitated. The house felt wrong, as though it was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. But she pushed the feeling aside. She was here to uncover the truth. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The further she went, the colder it became. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the feeling in the air, thick and oppressive, like something was pressing in on her. She moved cautiously, taking in the details of the rooms she passed. An old grandfather clock, its hands frozen in time, a dusty piano in the corner of the room, its keys yellowed with age. But there was nothing that seemed out of the ordinary, nothing except the silence. She made her way up the staircase. The stairs groaned under her weight, the sound unsettling in the otherwise quiet house. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and narrow, with doors on either side. Her heart raced, and she found herself wondering if she was making a mistake. But she was here now. She couldn't turn back. She opened the first door on her right. Inside, the room was empty. Just a few pieces of old furniture scattered around, a mirror covered in a thick layer of dust. Nothing seemed out of place, but there was something about the room that felt off. She couldn't quite place it. A sense of unease hung in the air, as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She turned and moved on to the next room. This one was larger, its walls adorned with old paintings. But as she stepped inside, the floorboard creaked loudly beneath her, and she froze. The sound seemed to reverberate through the room, echoing in her ears. And then from somewhere above her she heard it, a soft sound like footsteps. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone or something was walking around above her. She felt her stomach drop, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alone. She had seen the house from the outside, and it was empty. No one had lived here for years. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth as if they were coming closer. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her skin prickling with cold. She wanted to run. She should run, but her feet were frozen in place. Then the footsteps stopped. There was silence again. Complete silence. Sarah's mind raced. What was that? Who? What was up there? She knew she shouldn't go any further, that she should leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The need to understand, to uncover the truth, was overpowering. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The sound of a door creaking open reached her ears. It was distant, coming from upstairs. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't stand it anymore. She had to see what was happening. Her legs trembled as she slowly climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched before her, dark and narrow, with doors leading off to rooms she couldn't even begin to imagine. She walked cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her hand, the beam of light dancing along the walls. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, and Sarah could see a faint light coming from the crack. She approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike any she had seen before. It was small, almost like a child's bedroom, with an old, ornate crib in the center. The crib was empty, but what caught her attention was the strange, almost ethereal light that seemed to glow from the walls. It wasn't the warm yellow of a light bulb. It was pale, cold, almost otherworldly. And then she heard it, a soft voice, a whisper like the wind through the trees. It was coming from the crib. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost a breath, but unmistakable. Sarah felt a cold chill race down her spine. She backed away slowly, her mind spinning, her heart racing. She turned to leave, but then, bang! The door slammed shut behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her flashlight flickering. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was locked tight. She pounded on it with her fists, panic rising in her chest. The whisper came again. Closer now. "Help me." Then, the temperature in the room dropped, the air growing colder than she had ever felt before. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving toward her. A low, guttural sound filled the air, something that wasn't quite a voice, but more like a growl, deep and unnatural. Sarah screamed. She banged on the door again, harder this time, desperation flooding her veins. The growling grew louder, more insistent, the shadows moving closer, swirling around her like a storm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The door creaked open on its own. Sarah stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, her body trembling with fear. She didn't know what she had just experienced, but she didn't care. She needed to get out of there. She ran down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of footsteps still echoing in her ears. She burst through the front door and into the night air, gasping for breath. She didn't stop running until she was far away from the house, her legs aching, her mind spinning. The house stood silent behind her, its windows dark and empty once again. But Sarah knew what she had heard, what she had seen, and she knew that she would never be the same again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The house had always been quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. I had moved into the small cottage on the edge of town after the sudden death of my mother, hoping that a change of scenery would give me the space I needed to grieve. The house, perched at the end of a winding lane, had been empty for years. Its previous owners had left abruptly, according to the neighbors, without giving any clear reason why. The moment I stepped inside, though, I knew this was where I would stay. The walls, though weathered, seemed welcoming, the old hardwood floors creaking in a comforting way. It was perfect for a fresh start. But something was off. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first I noticed the small things. Objects would occasionally be out of place. A spoon on the counter that hadn't been there the night before. A chair slightly moved from where I had left it. The doors would creak open even when I knew I had locked them. Still, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a stressful few months, after all. As the weeks passed, though, the strange occurrences grew harder to ignore. It started with the voices. At night, when the house was at its quietest, I would hear faint whispers coming from the walls. They were soft, barely audible at first, and seemed to travel through the house, never staying in one place for too long. The sound of hushed conversation, the occasional laugh, a name spoken in the dark. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart racing, wondering if I was losing my mind. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, the house settling, anything that made sense, but the whispers didn't stop, and they didn't sound like the wind. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and grabbed the flashlight I kept beside my pillow. Slowly, I crept down the hallway, the beam of light flicking across the walls, the floors. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak amplified in the silence. I reached the kitchen, the source of the whispers, and stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. I was about to turn back when the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. My breath misted in front of me, and I could see my own shiver reflected in the beam of the flashlight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, somewhere deep inside, that I was not alone. Then I heard it again. A soft whisper, clearer this time. My name, Lena, Lena. I froze. The voice was clear, unmistakable. It was my mother's voice. My heart stopped for a moment as I struggled to comprehend what I had just heard. My mother had died 2 months ago, and her voice had no place here. I turned toward the sound, but the room was empty. Lena, come closer. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a command, an irresistible pull that tugged at my very soul. The voice was filled with an emotion I couldn't place. Urgent, desperate, pleading. I tried to shake off the fear, tried to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was a memory, an echo of grief playing tricks on me. But as the voice called my name again, my body moved on its own. I didn't want to go toward it, but my legs carried me forward, drawn by the sound, as though it were more powerful than my own will. The flashlight's beam bounced across the walls, revealing nothing but shadows. But I didn't need the light anymore. I could feel it. The presence. It was there, just beyond the reach of my senses. The kitchen was colder now. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, creeping along the floor, up the walls, over the cabinets. I reached the doorway and stepped into the next room, the old dining room where my mother and I had once sat together for meals. But now it was empty. The table stood in the middle of the room, undisturbed, just as it had been before. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the old fireplace, was a figure, a shape, cloaked in shadow. It was tall and thin, its features indistinguishable in the dim light. But I could feel its presence, pressing against me, suffocating me. The air grew heavier, colder. The voice spoke again, but now it was no longer my mother's. It was darker, colder, twisted. Lena, it's time to come home. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short gasps. My heart pounded in my chest. What was this? What was happening? My mind raced, but there was no logic to explain it. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. Panic flooded my veins. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, swirling around me. I reached for the door handle, pulling and pushing in vain, but it wouldn't budge. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, my body trembling with fear. The figure came closer, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't my mother, it wasn't even human. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow pits of blackness, the darkness inside them endless and consuming. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, pale and ashen. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and a low, guttural laugh echoed from deep within its chest. "You should have left when you had the chance," it said, its voice a distorted version of the whispers I had heard. I didn't know what it was. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get out. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, and the room seemed to spin around me. I screamed, but my voice was lost in the oppressive silence of the house. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The air lightened, the temperature returning to normal. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, those hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. The whispers had stopped, but the house felt different now, more suffocating, as if it were alive, watching me, waiting for something. The following days passed in a blur of fear and confusion. I called a priest, a local historian, anyone who might offer an explanation for the terror I had experienced. But none of them had answers. The house had no history of violent death, no tragic past. It was just a house, yet something about it had changed since I had moved in, something I couldn't explain. I continued to hear the whispers, though. At night, just before sleep took me, I could hear them again, soft, distant, beckoning. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to find the door to the room I had locked open, the air thick with the feeling of being watched. The presence was still there, always lurking just beyond my awareness. I couldn't escape it. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night I dreamed of the house, of my mother, standing in the doorway, beckoning me to come closer. She was always smiling, always kind, but when I reached her, her face would twist, her skin would rot away, and the thing that had taken her place would smile, its jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. It would speak in that same distorted voice, telling me that I was meant to stay, that I belonged here. One night, the dream was different. I found myself standing in the living room facing the fireplace. The fire was out and the room was cold. I heard a creak behind me, and when I turned, there it was, the figure standing tall and still in the doorway. But this time, I wasn't afraid. It stepped forward, its black eyes locked onto mine. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me. And this time, I knew what I had to do. The moment it reached out toward me, I grabbed the old family heirloom my mother had left behind, an antique knife that had been passed down through generations. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I plunged the blade into the figure's chest, the metal biting deep. It screamed, not with its mouth, but through my mind. A screech of pure agony and rage, the figure collapsed, disintegrating into the shadows as the house trembled around me. The floorboards cracked, the walls shook, and the air filled with a deafening roar. And then, silence. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, but the house was still. The shadows were gone. It was over. For now. I left the cottage the next morning, never looking back. The house stood silent in the distance as I drove away, the memory of what had happened still fresh in my mind. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had found a new home just beyond the edge of my perception. I don't know where it is now, but I know it's waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
Nathan never believed in ghosts. Not when his grandmother swore she had seen shadows moving in her old house. Not when his friends told stories about haunted roads where phantom figures appeared in the rearview mirror. Not even when he moved into the house on Redford Lane and the real estate agent hesitated when he asked why it had been on the market for so long. The house was old. Early 1900s, with creaky wooden floors, a wraparound porch, and a basement that smelled of damp earth. It needed work, but Nathan saw potential. It was his first home, and he was eager to make it his own. The first few weeks were uneventful. The place had its quirks, doors that stuck in the summer humidity, pipes that groaned when the water ran, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, things started happening. It began with the door at the end of the hall, the one leading to the small storage room. Nathan never used that room much. It was empty, except for a few old chairs left by the previous owners. But every morning, when he woke up, the door was open. At first, he blamed himself. Maybe he hadn't closed it all the way. Maybe the house was settling, but then one night he made sure to shut it tight. He even wedged a chair under the handle. The next morning, the door was wide open. The chair hadn't moved. Nathan stood in the doorway, staring into the dark room, a chill running down his spine. He swallowed hard and muttered to himself, "It's just an old house." That night, he had the dream for the first time. A woman stood in the hallway just outside his bedroom door. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, her dress old-fashioned, tattered. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching. Nathan woke up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering. He told himself it was just a nightmare, stress from work, that exhaustion. But the feeling of being watched stayed with him long after he woke. The next few nights, the dreams continued. The woman never came closer, never said a word, but she was always there, standing just outside his bedroom. One night, Nathan woke up at exactly 3:07 a.m. to the sound of something soft brushing against the floor, like bare feet moving across the wooden boards. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head toward the bedroom door. It was open, his stomach twisted. He was sure he had closed it before bed. He reached for his phone to check the time, the dim glow of the screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps stopped. Nathan held his breath, listening. Silence. Then from the hallway, a whisper, too faint to understand. His entire body tensed. He wanted to get up to turn on everything in the house, but he couldn't move. Then the whisper came again, closer. This time he understood. "Let me in." Nathan bolted upright and turned on the bedside lamp, the warm light flooding the room. His chest rose and fell with each heavy breath. The hallway was empty. The door to the storage room was open again. Nathan didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, he went to work exhausted, his nerves frayed. He tried to convince himself he was imagining things. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Maybe he was dreaming the whole thing. Then he got a text from his friend Brian. "Dude, are you home?" Nathan frowned. "No, why? I just drove past your place. Thought I saw someone standing in your upstairs window." Nathan felt ice spread through his veins. What did they look like? Brian's response came almost immediately. "A woman. Long hair. Looked like she was watching me." Nathan left work early. He rushed home, half expecting to find his front door kicked open, his house ransacked. But nothing was out of place, except for the storage room door. Wide open. That night, he tried something new. He set up his phone to record while he slept. The next morning, he hesitated before pressing play. The video showed him sleeping peacefully, turning over occasionally. Hours passed with nothing unusual. Then at 3:17 a.m., something changed. The bedroom door creaked open, slowly, inch by inch. Nathan's stomach clenched. Then, movement in the hallway. A shadow. It was faint, but it was there. A figure standing just outside his door, watching. The video ended with no further movement, but that was enough. Nathan packed a bag that morning and stayed at a hotel. That night, he did more research into the house. It took hours of digging, but he finally found an old newspaper article from 1956. A woman named Eleanor Hayes had lived in the house. She had been reported missing by her family. She was never found. Nathan stared at the grainy black and white photo in the article. Long, dark hair, hollow eyes, the same woman from his dreams. The next day, he called in a paranormal investigator. The man walked through the house, stopping in the hallway near the storage room. "This is where it's strongest," he muttered. Nathan swallowed. "What is?" The investigator turned to him. "She never left." Nathan's mouth went dry. "Why is she still here?" The investigator's gaze darkened. "Because she was hidden, forgotten." He paused. "She wants to be found." Nathan's stomach twisted. After a long moment, the investigator spoke again. "Have you checked behind the walls?" Nathan's blood ran cold. That night, he stood in front of the storage room, flashlight in hand. He knocked on the walls, listening. Then, a hollow sound. Nathan's hands trembled as he grabbed a crowbar and pried at the old wooden paneling. The wood splintered, crumbling away, and behind it, bones. Small, fragile, human. Nathan stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. The police were called. The remains were examined. DNA tests confirmed it. Eleanor Hayes. She had been there for nearly 70 years. Hidden away. Forgotten. The house was no longer a home after that. Nathan moved out within a week, refusing to stay another night. But the night before he left, something happened. For the first time since he moved in, he slept without nightmares. And when he woke up, the storage room door was closed, sealed shut, as if it had never been opened. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The chill in the air was undeniable as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small stack of old letters in front of her. They were her grandmother's, fragile and yellowed with age. But they weren't what made her stomach tighten. It was the one letter at the bottom of the pile, the letter that she had never seen before. She had spent her childhood visiting her grandmother in the old Victorian house tucked at the edge of the woods. It was a house that had always felt both warm and unsettling. She remembered the creaking floors, the strange hums from the walls at night, and the way the house seemed to whisper when the wind blew just right. But her grandmother never spoke much about the house's past, and after her passing, Sarah had moved on, leaving the house behind. Now, years later, she had come to clean out the house and sort through its remnants. As she carefully unfolded the crinkled paper, she saw the familiar handwriting of her grandmother. But the words written inside seemed wrong, more frantic than she remembered. I know what happened here, but no one will believe me. I wish I could have left you a warning, but now it's too late. Please, Sarah, don't ever return to this house. Don't open the attic. It's the only place where they can't get to you. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart raced. What did this mean? What was in the attic? She had always been told to stay away from that part of the house, but it had always seemed like one of those rules that didn't need explanation, just one of those unspoken truths. Now, with her grandmother's cryptic warning in hand, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She quickly shoved the letter back into the envelope and stood up. The house creaked under her feet as she made her way up the stairs. Her feet moved on their own accord, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. She reached the top of the stairs, and there it was, the door to the attic. Old, faded wood with brass hinges that had started to tarnish with time. Her grandmother had kept it locked, always telling Sarah it was for her own good. Sarah had never questioned it until now. Her hand trembled as she reached for the key that hung on a hook by the door. She inserted it into the lock, and with a loud click, the door creaked open. The attic was musty, filled with the smell of dust and old wood. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight as she stepped inside, and the dim light from the single bulb above barely illuminated the space. The room was filled with boxes, old furniture covered in white sheets, and stacks of newspapers yellowed with age. But it was the far corner of the attic that caught her attention. A large, old-fashioned mirror stood against the wall, its silver frame tarnished, but still gleaming in the half-light. She had never seen it before. Sarah approached it cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps. As she got closer, she noticed something strange. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple, as if the glass wasn't completely solid. The reflection she saw didn't match the dim light of the room around her. Instead, the reflection was bright, too bright, and it looked like daylight, even though there was no sunlight coming through the attic windows. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the reflection. In the mirror, there was a figure standing in the corner of the room, just barely visible at first. It was a woman, her back to Sarah, her dark hair flowing down to her shoulders. But there was something wrong about the reflection. The woman's movements were too slow, too deliberate. Her back seemed hunched, as though she were waiting. Sarah blinked, trying to convince herself it was just a trick of the light. But when she opened her eyes again, the figure had turned to face her. The woman's eyes were black, completely black, with no pupils or whites, just endless darkness. Her lips parted in a grotesque, unnatural smile, and her face twisted in a way that made Sarah's stomach turn. The woman's mouth stretched too wide, too unnaturally, as though her jaw might snap in half. "Get out," the reflection whispered, though Sarah could see no movement from the woman's lips. The words seemed to echo in her mind, a voice that reverberated through her skull like a pulse. The mirror began to vibrate, the glass warping more violently now. Sarah could feel a cold draft sweep over her, despite the stillness of the room. The attic door slammed shut behind her, and she spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she reached for the door, she found it locked, just like the first time she tried it. Panic surged through her. She rushed back toward the mirror, her breath fogging up the air. She had to leave. She had to get out before whatever was in that mirror came through. As she reached the glass, the reflection of the woman began to move again, faster now, jerking toward her. Sarah stumbled back, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. The woman in the mirror was no longer smiling. Her face was twisted in an expression of rage, and her hands shot out of the glass, grabbing at Sarah's wrists. Her fingers were like cold iron, and Sarah screamed as they tightened around her. With every ounce of strength, she yanked herself away from the mirror, falling to the floor with a loud crash. Her body shook as she scrambled to her feet, but the mirror didn't stop. The woman's form continued to writhe and twist, her hands reaching out, her face contorting in unnatural ways. The glass rippled, and Sarah could feel something pulling at her, something dark and heavy, as though the mirror were trying to suck her in. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she felt herself slipping, her feet lifting off the floor, her body being drawn toward the glass. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind, but it was too late. Whatever was in that mirror was not going to let her go without a fight. She barely had the strength to reach for the mirror, but when her hand brushed the cold surface, a shock of ice shot through her, numbing her fingers. In that instant, she saw something else, an image of her grandmother, standing beside the mirror, her face pale and drained of color. Her lips moved as though she were speaking, but Sarah couldn't hear the words. The woman in the mirror was pulling harder now, her body almost fully out of the glass, her hands reaching for Sarah's throat. In a desperate attempt to break free, Sarah grabbed the mirror and shoved it away with all her might. It crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces, and the force of the impact sent Sarah flying backwards. She landed hard on the ground, gasping for air, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The room was silent now. The attic felt unnervingly still. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman's presence was gone, but the air was thick with something, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. She turned back toward the broken mirror, her eyes scanning the pieces scattered across the floor. There was nothing there now. No figure. No reflection. Just shards of glass. As she gathered herself, trying to make sense of the nightmare she had just experienced, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible voice coming from behind her. "You shouldn't have come back." She froze. It was the voice of the woman from the mirror, but there was something else in it, something familiar, something from the past. Turning slowly, Sarah looked into the corner of the room, her eyes locking with the shadow that seemed to form from the darkness itself. It was her grandmother, or at least it looked like her. The figure of her grandmother stood there, eyes wide and lifeless, her mouth open in a silent scream. And as the shadowy figure of her grandmother stepped forward, Sarah realized with a horrifying jolt that it wasn't her grandmother at all. It was something much, much worse. Her grandmother had never left the house. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was a quiet, almost hauntingly still night when Eliza first noticed something strange in her new home. She had recently moved into a charming old Victorian house nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy little town. The house, with its intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and creaky floors, had instantly captivated her when she first walked through the front door. It seemed like the perfect place to start over. Eliza had spent the last year recovering from a difficult breakup, and moving to a new town was a fresh start she desperately needed. The house was large, with a sprawling garden, and while it wasn't exactly cheap, the price was right, almost too good to be true. As the days passed, though, Eliza started to wonder why it had been so affordable. She chalked it up to her overactive imagination. Old houses always came with their quirks, didn't they? At first, everything was fine. The house was peaceful. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly floral, like it hadn't been touched in years. The rooms, though filled with dust and cobwebs, had an undeniable charm. She began unpacking, organizing, and making it her own. She spent hours rearranging furniture, painting the walls, and slowly transforming the space into something that felt like home. But then, the first strange thing happened. It was late one evening when Eliza had just finished cleaning the kitchen. She'd set the last dish down in the drying rack and turned to head upstairs to bed. That's when she heard it. A soft, distant sound coming from the direction of the attic. A faint tapping. It wasn't constant, more like a sporadic, intermittent knock. Thinking it was the house settling, Eliza ignored it at first, but it didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, but tried to shake it off. "It's an old house," she muttered to herself. "Just the pipes or something." The tapping continued for several minutes, each sound growing slightly louder, closer. "Hello?" she called out, half expecting some sort of animal, maybe a squirrel or bird, to be making the noise. No answer. Only the quiet stillness of the house. Eliza hesitated for a moment before walking toward the attic stairs. The door to the attic was old, painted a faded blue, and creaked when she touched it. She opened it slowly, the hinges protesting with a long, drawn-out squeal. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, illuminated in the faint glow. Eliza stepped inside, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. There was a large trunk in the corner, covered in sheets and a few forgotten pieces of furniture, an old rocking chair, a weathered mirror, and a shelf full of antique books. The tapping had stopped. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Just silence. Eliza felt her heart rate pick up. She turned and made her way toward the trunk, drawn by a strange impulse. It was almost as though something in the room was pulling her toward it. When she reached it, she hesitated before lifting the dusty sheet that covered it. Underneath, the trunk looked old, older than the house, perhaps, and worn, with rusty metal corners and tarnished locks. As her fingers brushed the surface of the trunk, a cold gust of air rushed past her, making the hairs on her neck stand on end. She spun around, but there was no one there. No draft, no explanation, just a chill that seemed to come from nowhere. She quickly closed the lid of the trunk and backed away. Maybe it was time to call it a night, she thought, feeling unsettled. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something else. A shadow moving in the corner of the room. It wasn't just the play of light or a trick of her eyes. It was a figure, tall, gaunt, and indistinct, its features obscured by the dim lighting. The figure seemed to linger just beyond the edge of her vision, standing perfectly still. Eliza froze, her breath hitched in her throat. She blinked, and the shadow was gone. Her heart thudded in her chest as she backed toward the attic stairs, her eyes scanning the room, half expecting to see the shadow again, but it didn't reappear. The room felt oppressive now, heavy with an unexplainable weight. She hurried down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. The next few days were uneventful, but the unease lingered. Eliza kept herself busy, decorating the rest of the house and trying to push the strange incident from her mind. The attic, however, remained off limits. She didn't want to go up there again. Not yet, at least. One evening, a week later, as Eliza was sitting in the living room reading, she heard the tapping again. This time it was unmistakable. The sound was coming from the attic. Tap! 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 She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the house settling. But the sound persisted, growing louder and faster, like something was knocking at the door to the attic. Eliza stood up, her nerves frayed. Something told her she couldn't ignore it this time. With shaky hands, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the attic stairs. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, and she stepped into the attic again, the flashlight beam shaking as she swept it across the room. The dust and the musty air greeted her once more, but there was something else in the air, something thick and heavy. As she moved further into the attic, the tapping stopped abruptly. Silence. And then, in the corner of the room, she saw it again. The shadow. This time it was closer, much closer, looming in the corner near the trunk. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, and the flashlight beam trembled as she focused it on the figure. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a shape, a dark, twisted form that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. The thing was tall, its body thin and skeletal, with elongated arms that reached toward her like ghostly tendrils. Frozen in place, Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away. She felt a cold, clammy sensation wash over her, and a voice, whispering, barely audible, seeped into her mind. "Leave this place. Leave." The voice was so soft, so insistent, that it felt like it was inside her head. She could feel the weight of its presence pressing against her chest, suffocating her. It was all she could do to stay conscious. But then, in a sudden, frantic moment, Eliza snapped out of it. She turned and fled down the attic stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she was safely back in the living room, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. She locked the door to the attic and slumped against it, too terrified to move. For the rest of the night, she stayed awake, too frightened to sleep, too haunted by what she had seen. That shadow, those whispering words, had made something clear. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just quirky. It was haunted. The next morning, Eliza called a local paranormal investigator, desperate for answers. She couldn't live in a house where she was constantly on edge, where something unseen lingered in the corners, waiting. The investigator, a calm man named Robert, arrived later that day, bringing with him various tools, an EVP recorder, thermal cameras, and other gadgets to detect paranormal activity. Together, they made their way up to the attic. Robert began setting up his equipment while Eliza anxiously watched. "You're not imagining things," he said as he examined the readings on his monitor. "There's definitely something here, a strong presence. It's old, whatever it is." Eliza swallowed hard, her hands clammy. "What does that mean? Is it dangerous?" Robert paused, his face serious. "It's difficult to say, but it's definitely attached to the house. There's a history here, something dark." The rest of the investigation revealed unsettling details about the house's past, a history of tragedy and loss of families who had lived and died within these walls. Some had even gone missing. But the most chilling discovery came when they uncovered an old journal hidden in the attic, tucked away behind a loose floorboard. The journal belonged to a previous resident, a woman named Clara, who had lived in the house in the late 1800s. The journal spoke of a presence, a shadowy figure that had tormented Clara, whispering to her, driving her to madness. She wrote about hearing tapping sounds just like Eliza had and feeling a cold presence in the house. But the most disturbing entry described how the shadow had eventually taken on a physical form, reaching out to her, causing her to slowly lose her sanity. Robert's expression darkened as he read through the journal. "This is what's been here all along. It's tied to the house, and now it's latched onto you." Eliza felt her stomach drop. "What do I do? How do I make it stop?" "You have two choices," Robert said gravely. "You can leave, and it might let you go, or you can try to confront it, but that's dangerous, very dangerous." Eliza didn't have to think long. She didn't want to leave, not now, not after everything she'd done to make this place her home. "I'll confront it," she said, voice trembling. "I have to." Story the end.
Story number 6.
It started with the whispers. James Carter never believed in ghosts. He was a practical man, a history professor with a logical mind. But logic had no place in what happened at Holloway House. It was an old Victorian manor on the outskirts of Charleston, abandoned for decades. The house had a reputation, stories of disappearances, flickering lights in the windows, and figures moving in the shadows. Locals avoided it. But James, eager to research the history of the place for an upcoming book, dismissed the warnings as superstition. His first visit was uneventful. Dust and decay filled the grand house, its once majestic architecture now crumbling under the weight of time. The second visit, however, was different. James had just set up his camera and recorder in what used to be the parlor when he heard it. Soft, indistinct murmurs like voices in another room. He froze, holding his breath. "Hello?" He called, but the only reply was the silence pressing in on him. He brushed it off. The wind, perhaps, or the house settling. The next hour passed without incident, but as James reviewed his audio recording, his blood ran cold. Among the static and ambient noise, a whisper slithered through the speaker. "James." He dropped the recorder. His name, clear as day. A rational explanation evaded him. There was no one else in the house, and yet someone had spoken to him. Shaken but intrigued, he returned the next evening. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something had changed. The air was different, thicker, heavier. The scent of damp wood and decay was laced with something else, something acrid. As he made his way to the second floor, the wooden staircase groaned under his weight. His flashlight flickered. Then the whispers returned. This time, they weren't faint or distant. They were right behind him. "James!" His heart pounded. He spun around, light shaking in his hand. There was no one there. And yet the air crackled with something unseen. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching from the dark hallway. He could see nothing, but the sound was undeniable. James took a step back. The floor beneath him groaned, but the footsteps continued forward. The temperature plummeted. His breath curled in the air. Then a shadow detached from the darkness at the end of the hall. At first, it was shapeless, a void that seemed to consume the light around it. But as it neared, it formed into something humanoid, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs wrong, elongated. Its face, if it had one, was an absence, a void darker than the rest of the shadow. James stumbled back, his throat tight with fear. The thing stopped just a few feet from him, and the whispers surged, overlapping, a cacophony of voices, desperate, pleading. "Leave. James, leave." And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. Silence swallowed the air. Then a single word, so quiet it was almost a breath. "Run." James didn't need to be told twice. He bolted down the stairs, his own footsteps echoing wildly. As he reached the front door, he felt it, something brushing against his back, cold as death. He burst outside, lungs burning, heart hammering. The house loomed behind him, its broken windows like empty eyes. He never returned. Weeks later, he reviewed the footage from that night. Most of it was grainy, useless, but the last few seconds sent ice through his veins. As he had turned to run, the camera, mounted on his shoulder, had captured something behind him. A figure. Not a shadow this time, but a woman. She was pale, her eyes hollow pits of black, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. And just before the footage cut to static, she reached for him. James never spoke of Holloway House again. He moved states, abandoned his research, and tried to forget. But every now and then, when the night was still, when sleep was just within reach, he would hear it. A whisper, his name, right by his ear. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It started with a phone call in the middle of the night. Jenna Carter groggily reached for her phone, her heart already racing. No one called at 2:33 a.m. unless something was wrong. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled her to answer. The voice on the other end was distorted, almost like static, but she could still make out the words. Jenna, you have to leave. It's not safe. The call cut off. She sat up, her breath coming in short gasps. It had to be a prank. Who would call her like this? Her hands trembled as she checked her messages, but there was nothing. No missed calls, no record of an incoming call. She swallowed the lump in her throat. It had to be a dream. But she wasn't asleep. Jenna had moved into the old house on Oak Ridge Lane just a few weeks ago. It was a steal, a beautiful 2-story colonial, massive backyard, quiet neighborhood. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had passed away, and her children wanted the property gone quickly. It was an opportunity Jenna couldn't pass up. At first, everything seemed perfect, but then the little things started happening. Doors that she swore she had closed would be slightly ajar. Faucets turned on by themselves. Her cat, Luna, hissed at empty corners. And then there were the noises, whispers in the hallway, the creaking of footsteps overhead when she was alone. Jenna tried to ignore it. Old houses made sounds. Her mind was playing tricks on her, but that phone call changed everything. The next morning, she was on edge, every sound sending shivers down her spine. The rational part of her brain told her to brush it off, but something deep in her gut screamed otherwise. She decided to do some digging. The town's archives were filled with old newspaper clippings, but it didn't take long before she found something that made her blood run cold. The house had a history. In 1957, a woman named Margaret Holloway was found dead in the upstairs bedroom. The details were gruesome. She had been missing for weeks before her body was discovered. Her face contorted in terror, her fingernails torn and bloody, as if she had been trying to claw her way out of the very room where she was found. The official report ruled it as a heart attack brought on by fear, but the townsfolk whispered something different. She had seen something. Something unnatural. Jenna slammed the folder shut, her hands trembling. It was just a story, just an old urban legend. But when she returned home that night, something was waiting for her. It started with the shadows. As she entered the hallway, she noticed the air was different, thicker, suffocating. The light flickered. The air smelled of something rotting. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Something shifted in the dark, just beyond the staircase. She turned, but there was nothing, a whisper. Low, almost a breath against her ear. Jenna, her stomach dropped. The whisper wasn't in her head, it was real. She bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Luna was curled up on the bed, her eyes wide, ears pinned back. The air was thick with something unseen, something wrong. Then the knocking started. It was slow at first, deliberate, a soft, almost polite tapping against the bedroom door. Then it grew louder. Bang, bang, bang. She clapped her hands over her ears, willing it to stop. Then silence. A moment passed, then another. She dared to breathe. Then a single whisper. "Let me in," Jenna screamed. The next few days were a blur. She refused to sleep, refused to be alone in that house. The shadows grew darker, the whispers louder. Objects moved on their own. She couldn't stay. Packing her bags in a frenzy, she booked a motel across town. As she drove away, she swore she saw something in the upstairs window. Something pale, watching. She never returned. The house on Oak Ridge Lane remains empty to this day. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors say they see a shadow moving past the windows. And if you stand close enough to the house, you might hear it. A whisper. Let me in. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was a dreary Tuesday afternoon when I first decided to step into the old farmhouse. The wind had been howling for hours, the sky threatening rain. A perfect day, it seemed, to investigate the house that had haunted our town for generations. The Holloway House, as it was known, had always been a place of mystery, wrapped in stories of ghostly apparitions, flickering lights, and eerie sounds in the dead of night. I had heard the whispers of the old-timers when I was a kid, the ones who had grown up in this town and knew the place far better than I did. But I never believed in the supernatural. I'd always thought it was just an old house, full of creaks and groans that fueled the imagination of the easily scared. As a reporter, I'd spent years chasing down stories that could be explained away with logic and reason. This house was something else. It had been abandoned for years, and yet the rumors never stopped. The oddest part was that no one had ever gone inside. It had become a landmark in town, a creepy, neglected symbol of what once was. The older folks said no one had the courage to go in, and maybe they were right. No one had ever reported being inside, and even the most fearless of people would change the subject whenever the house was mentioned. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing out on something significant. There were too many stories that didn't make sense. Too many people who swore something wasn't right in that place. I figured, what better way to separate fact from fiction than to go in myself? So there I stood in front of the dilapidated old house, my fingers cold as I adjusted my grip on the camera in my hands. The old farmstead loomed above me, its once white walls now gray and cracked, covered in moss and ivy. The windows, most of them shattered, stared out like hollow eyes. The porch sagged under the weight of neglect, the steps crooked and uneven. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I had to do this. The door was half open, hanging at an odd angle as if it hadn't been touched in decades. I nudged it with my shoulder and stepped inside. The air hit me first, a cold, musty smell, like old books and wet earth. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked further into the house, the sounds echoing through the emptiness. Dust covered everything. The walls were cracked, and remnants of old wallpaper peeled away in strips, leaving ghostly traces of faded patterns. It was silent at first, the only noise the steady beat of my heart. But as I ventured deeper into the house, the silence began to feel thicker somehow. Heavier, as though it was pressing in on me from all sides. I moved through the hall, my footsteps loud in the otherwise still air. The house seemed to stretch on endlessly, room after room, all eerily similar. Abandoned furniture, cracked mirrors, and old portraits that looked like they had been left in haste. I could feel the weight of the history in these rooms, the lives once lived, now erased. But what was it that made this place so unsettling? I found the stairs leading to the upper floor, narrow and steep. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I wasn't here for some simple story. I needed to understand. I took the stairs carefully, one step at a time, the wood groaning beneath me with each move. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and oppressive. There were 4 doors, each one slightly ajar, but only one of them seemed to draw me in. It was the door at the end of the hallway. I walked toward it, the air getting colder the closer I got. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom, but it was nothing like I had expected. The room was pristine. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tight. There were no signs of decay, no dust on the furniture. It was as if someone had been living in it just yesterday. But there was no one here now. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. My camera clicked as I took a few pictures of the room, but as soon as the flash went off, something strange happened. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically. It wasn't just a little colder, it felt like I had stepped into a freezer. I froze, my pulse quickening. A chill ran through me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. Just an ordinary bedroom. Except it wasn't. There was something on the nightstand, something I hadn't noticed before. A picture frame. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. They were all smiling, standing together in front of this very house, their faces radiating happiness. The date on the back of the photo was 1923. The family looked normal, nothing out of the ordinary, but there was one odd detail. The woman's face had been scratched out. I stared at the photo for a long time, my fingers tightening around the frame. There was something unsettling about that woman's face. Her eyes, they didn't look right. They seemed too hollow, too empty, as though the person who had scratched it out was trying to erase something. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint whisper. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. It had come from behind me, soft and almost melodic, like a voice that was too far away to make out. I turned the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness of the room. Nothing. The whisper came again. Leave. The voice was clearer this time, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step back, the camera still in my hands. My mind was racing. Who or what was in this house with me? I turned and ran out of the room, down the hallway, back toward the stairs. The house groaned around me, its wooden structure creaking and sighing as though it were alive. The temperature seemed to be dropping even further now. My breath was visible in the air, each exhale clouding up the space in front of me. I was almost at the stairs when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming from somewhere upstairs. Someone or something was walking in the attic. I stood frozen, my body tense. I could feel my heart in my throat, pounding like a drum. My feet were rooted to the floor. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Then from behind me, I heard the faintest sound of a door creaking open. I turned, my flashlight shaking in my hands. There, at the end of the hallway, the door to the room I had just left was standing wide open. I hadn't left it that way. Before I could react, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound of footsteps came again, louder now, getting closer, as if something or someone was moving swiftly toward me. I spun around and ran down the stairs, barely able to keep my footing on the slippery, worn steps. The house seemed to close in around me, the walls seeming to shift as I descended. Every creak, every groan was amplified, as though the house itself was alive and angry that I had dared to intrude. I reached the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle. It wouldn't open. I pulled harder, panic clawing at me. The footsteps were so close now, I could hear them directly behind me. It was as though they were right there, just out of reach. I could feel the presence in the house, something watching, something waiting. Finally, the door gave way, and I burst outside into the cold air, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the road, the house looming behind me like a dark, silent sentinel. I didn't look back, and I never went back. The Holloway house remained abandoned, untouched by human hands. The stories still circulate, but now, when they are told, there's a new one added to the list, a warning, and I'll never forget the whisper. Leave. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It began with the smell. Laura Mitchell had always considered herself a skeptic. Ghost stories, paranormal encounters, and haunted houses, none of it ever fazed her. She had always believed that fear lived in the mind, that unexplained events always had logical answers. But what happened in the winter of 2018 changed everything. Laura had just moved into a small, 2-bedroom rental house in the rural town of Millbrook, Indiana. She was fresh off a breakup, eager for a change, and the house, despite being old, was cozy, affordable, and only a few miles from her new job at the local library. It started on the third night. She woke up to an overwhelming scent of something rotting. It was thick, pungent, and clung to the air like a damp fog. It smelled like meat left out for too long, spoiled, sickly sweet, and unmistakably foul. Confused, she stumbled out of bed and checked the kitchen, the trash, even the drains, but nothing explained the odor. By morning, it was gone. The following night, it returned. Stronger. This time, Laura felt something else, a weight in the air, like a presence pressing down on her. She checked every inch of the house, but found nothing. The scent lingered for hours, making her nauseous before fading just before dawn. It became a pattern. Every night, the smell would return, sometimes faint, sometimes so strong it made her gag. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, called the landlord, even had a plumber come out to check the pipes. No one could explain it. And then the knocking started. It was always the same. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, always at exactly 3:12 a.m. the front end. The first time it happened, Laura jolted awake, heart hammering. The sound had come from the front door. She hesitated before getting up. Who would be knocking at this hour? She peeked out the window but saw nothing. Just the empty street, silent and still under the glow of the street lamp. She checked the peephole. No one. Slowly, she unlocked the door and opened it just an inch. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine, but there was no one there. Just as she was about to shut the door, she heard it. A whisper. So soft, she almost thought she imagined it. Laura. Her breath hitched. The voice was right in her ear, as if someone was standing inches away. She slammed the door, locked it, and sat awake in bed until sunrise. For weeks, the knocking continued. Always 3 knocks. Always at 3:12 a.m., she stopped opening the door. Then the dreams began. Laura would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the lingering fear. The dreams were always the same. She was standing in the hallway, staring at her bedroom door. Something was on the other side. A shadow, tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't speak. But she knew, deep in her bones, that it was waiting for her. Then she would wake up. One night, she woke to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. Her stomach turned to ice. She had locked it before going to bed. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she turned on the flashlight. The door was open just a crack. The hallway beyond was pitch black. She sat up slowly, holding her breath, waiting, listening. Then she heard it. Breathing. Low, raspy, just beyond the doorway. Laura couldn't move. Her body was frozen in terror. The breathing grew louder, closer. Then the door slammed shut. She screamed. For the first time in her life, she felt true, paralyzing fear. The next morning, she packed a bag and drove to her friend Melissa's house, refusing to spend another night alone. Melissa was skeptical but agreed to stay with her the following night. That was the night everything escalated. At 3:12 a.m., the knocking came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Melissa sat up, wide-eyed. What the hell was that? Laura didn't answer. She was too afraid to breathe. Then, the temperature in the room dropped. The air grew thick, heavy. A shadow stretched across the bedroom wall, and then the smell returned. Rotting, foul, suffocating. Melissa gagged, covering her mouth. What is that? Then the whisper, right between them. Let me in, Melissa shrieked, scrambling to turn on the lamp. The second the light flooded the room, the shadow vanished. The knocking stopped, the smell disappeared, but the fear remained. They left that night and never returned. Laura broke her lease, moved in with Melissa, and never spoke of the house again. A few months later, curiosity got the better of her, and she searched for information on the property. What she found made her blood run cold. In 1965, a man named Robert Kessler had lived in that house. He was a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors, until one night he simply vanished. When the police searched the house, they found something horrifying. The walls of his bedroom were covered in scratches, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. In the middle of the room, they found deep, bloody grooves in the floorboards. And on the door, scrawled in jagged, desperate letters, "Don't let him in." Laura never looked back, but sometimes late at night, she still wakes up at exactly 3:12 a.m., and for a brief, terrifying moment, she swears she can hear it. A whisper, "Let me in."
Story number 10.
Got it. Here's your terrifying ghost story. I never believed in ghosts. I used to scoff at ghost hunters, horror movies, and people who swore they had seen a spirit. Then I moved into that house. It was an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town. A little too cheap for what it was worth. The realtor told me the previous owner had died, but she reassured me it was of natural causes. I wasn't superstitious, so I signed the lease without hesitation. That was my first mistake. The first few nights were uneventful. The house creaked, but I expected that from an old home. The pipes rattled now and then, and the wind howled through the trees outside. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I started noticing things. The first sign was subtle, things moving from where I last placed them. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. A book that was on the coffee table would be on the floor. My phone charger was suddenly unplugged and across the room. Small things. Nothing major, but unsettling. Then the whispers started. I'd be lying in bed at night, drifting off to sleep when I'd hear it. Faint voices, like a distant radio playing. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe neighbors or late-night walkers. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The voices were inside the house. I started losing sleep. The more I tried to listen, the more it became apparent that the whispers weren't just random. They were speaking directly to me. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them. They were watching me. One night, I decided to record the whispers. I left my phone on my nightstand, recording throughout the night. The next morning, I played it back, expecting to hear static or faint mumblings. But what I heard chilled me to my core. It was my own voice. But I had no memory of speaking. My recorded voice was whispering things I couldn't understand, a guttural, otherworldly murmur overlapping with something else, another voice speaking in unison with me. A voice that wasn't mine. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but convinced myself it was just sleep talking. I had to be rational, but my body knew better. Every night, my chest tightened as darkness fell. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I ignored them. I had nowhere else to go. Then, the nightmares started. I dreamt of being trapped in the house, locked inside while shadows moved across the walls. A woman stood at the foot of my bed, her face hidden beneath a veil of black hair. She whispered to me in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. She was angry. One night, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of the living room. I had no recollection of getting out of bed. The front door was wide open. My hands were freezing, my breath visible in the dead silence of the night. I started locking my bedroom door, but every morning it was open. The next day, I found scratches on my arms, deep and raw, as if I had been clawing at myself in my sleep. I checked the sheets. There were no rips, no signs of anything that could have caused the wounds. I was losing my mind. Then, I saw her. It was around 3 a.m. I had been tossing and turning, too scared to sleep. My room was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. That's when I noticed the shadow. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure stood in the corner of my room, just beyond the reach of light. It was tall, its shape unmistakably human, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. The air grew heavy. My ears filled with a deep droning hum, like a swarm of insects buzzing inside my skull. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if something had clamped its icy fingers around my throat, silencing me. My body was paralyzed, my heart hammering inside my chest. The shadow stepped closer, and the light from the window illuminated her face. It was a woman. Her skin was gray, almost translucent. Her eyes were black voids, endless pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. And then, she lunged. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out because I woke up on the floor, my body drenched in sweat. My bedroom door was open again. The entire house felt wrong, like I had stepped into a place that was no longer mine. That was the final straw. I packed my things and left that morning. I didn't care about my lease, didn't care about losing money. I just wanted to get out. A few days later, I met up with a realtor, demanding to know more about the house's history. She hesitated before finally admitting the truth. The previous owner hadn't died of natural causes. She had been found in the house, her body locked inside the bedroom. The autopsy reported no external injuries, no signs of trauma, but her face was frozen in a silent scream, and her fingernails were ripped off as if she had been clawing at something. I never went back. But sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers and I know she's still looking for me. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The house stood on the edge of town, separated from the nearest neighbor by a half-mile of untamed woods and crumbling stone fences. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but to the few who passed by, it seemed timeless. The locals knew the house well, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. Everyone knew the stories. It was a curious thing for someone like me, a writer always on the lookout for inspiration. I had heard whispers about the house all my life, but like most people, I had dismissed it as nothing more than superstition. After all, nothing ever happened, right? It was just a decaying building with a long-forgotten past. Until one afternoon, I found myself standing in front of it, my curiosity getting the better of me. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the typical damp, moldy scent of an abandoned house. No, it was something sharper, something metallic like blood or rust. The front door, once a vibrant red, was now chipped and cracked, hanging loosely on its hinges. Through the window, I could see the outlines of furniture, long covered in dust and sheets, abandoned in their final resting places. I pushed open the door, the wood groaning in protest. The cold air that greeted me inside was thick with dust, and the silence was so profound it felt suffocating. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I ventured deeper into the house, the creaking of the floors adding to the eerie atmosphere. I had no particular reason for being here. As a writer, I was always looking for stories, and a haunted house was the perfect setting for one. Maybe I'd find something in here, some old journals or letters, relics of a time long gone. Perhaps I could even talk to someone who had lived here, if I was lucky. The house seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its walls lined with fading wallpaper, the faint outline of a family portrait still visible in the hallway. It was a place frozen in time, where the passage of years could be seen but not felt. It felt empty in the way a tomb feels empty, but not quiet. As I made my way through the hallway, I heard something. At first, it was so faint I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. A whisper, a soft murmur, barely audible above the sound of my own breathing. I stopped and listened, trying to isolate the sound. It wasn't the wind, I knew that much. It was too deliberate, too human. I turned slowly, scanning the dark corners of the hallway. No one, just the thick, oppressive silence. I continued walking, but I was more aware of the noises around me now. The groan of the wood beneath my feet, the creak of the ceiling above. And then as I entered the living room, the temperature dropped. It wasn't a gradual chill, but a sudden, sharp cold that cut through me. I could see my breath in the air, a pale fog that drifted around me as I moved. I shivered involuntarily, but it wasn't from the cold. The feeling in the room had changed. The weight of the silence had become thicker, more oppressive. Something was watching me. I could feel it. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but no one was there. I stood in the middle of the room, the floorboards creaking under my weight, my heart pounding in my chest. For the first time since entering the house, I began to feel something real, something terrifying. I was no longer alone in this place. I walked toward the staircase, almost against my will. It was as though my body was moving on its own, drawn by something unseen. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended slowly, carefully, afraid to make too much noise. Each step was a prayer, hoping the floor wouldn't collapse beneath me. The second floor was even darker than the first, with only a single beam of light from the cracked window illuminating the hallway. I could see the shapes of doors, some open, some closed, but it was the room at the end of the hall that caught my attention. It was the only one with the door fully open, and it seemed to beckon me, pulling me closer with an invisible force. I hesitated for a moment, but my feet carried me forward, toward the room. As I crossed the threshold, I felt an immediate change in the atmosphere. The air was suffocating, thick with the remnants of something ancient. The room was small, with a low ceiling, and a single bed pushed against one wall. The sheets were in disarray, as if someone had hastily gotten up in the middle of the night and fled. There were no windows, just a single dusty lamp in the corner that barely worked. The walls were bare, save for a large, ornate mirror that hung on the wall opposite the bed. I froze when I saw it. There, in the reflection of the mirror, was a figure. It wasn't clear, just a faint shape, almost like a shadow. But it was there. I could see it. I took a step back, my breath quickening. My hand reached for the flashlight in my pocket, but when I turned it on, the reflection was gone. The mirror was empty. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the overwhelming sensation of being watched returning tenfold. I turned away, trying to steady my breath, but as I did, the whisper came again. It was louder this time, clearer. Leave. Now. It wasn't a soft murmur anymore. It was a command. A voice, low and almost guttural, reverberated through my chest. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet, my mind racing. Who was it? What was it? The temperature had dropped even further now, and I could feel the cold wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of that house as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. It was as if I was stuck in place, trapped by some unseen force. I felt something brush against my shoulder, cold fingers, or maybe just the draft of air. I didn't know, but I didn't want to find out. I willed my legs to move, to step forward, but nothing happened. The whisper came again, louder this time. Leave. With all my strength, I finally forced myself to turn and stumble toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the threshold, I stopped. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a person. Or at least it looked like a person. But it wasn't human. Not anymore. The figure was tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were hollow, empty black sockets that seemed to suck in the light around them. It was staring at me, unmoving, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my vision narrowing as the figure took a step toward me. I turned. I ran. I sprinted down the hall, down the stairs, through the living room, and out the door. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My legs burned as I bolted through the overgrown yard, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air outside felt warmer, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I was back in town, my legs aching, my mind reeling. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me, but the house was still, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't explain what I had seen. I couldn't explain the whispers, the figure, or the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled that house. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never go back. Story the end.